Is this working? Yeah. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Jacqueline Bhabha, and I'm a faculty member who's associated with the Carr Center, very happily so. And I'm very happy to see a few of you here today to discuss what is, in fact, an enormously important and complex topic of the relationship between climate change and migration. So I thought I'd just kick us off before I introduce our speaker with just two general points. The first is that though the reality of climate change and its impact on the planet and the planet's inhabitants is, or should certainly be, uncontroversial, the extent of that impact is subject to debate, and there are, as anybody who works in this field knows, widely discrepant estimates, which make it hard to kind of get one's head around what is actually going on and what one should actually plan for, especially if that's, your concern. If you are looking at the kind of basic science of climate change, that may not be such a consideration. But if you're a policymaker, somebody who's interested in the way in which societal adjustments adapt to pressures, then certainly that's a factor. But I thought I would, contrary to my usual spirit, give you a worst case scenario. And I usually get quite irritated by the kind of catastrophism that sometimes dominates this field. But in a worst case scenario, according to the World Bank, if there's no serious change in greenhouse gas emissions, by 2050, up to 39% of the global population could live in environments that are considered outside the, quotes, human climate niche. So just think about that. It's kind of a hard to fathom magnitude that about, or a bit more than 1 in every 3 people on Earth in just 25 years would be living in an unlivable climate. That is an enormous challenge. That's a really unbelievable prospect, and admittedly a worst case scenario, but it is a scenario put forward by the World Bank, so not completely outside the realm of some sort of possibility, I suppose. So one obvious conclusion is that very, very large numbers of people, billions of people, would be forced to leave their homes. And of course, of those very, very large numbers, many would leave to somewhere else within their own country. As we know, they would be what we technically call IDPs, internally displaced persons, which outnumber international forced migrants by at least 2 to 1 already. So many of those people forced to leave their normal home would not cross an international border. But a sizable minority would probably have to cross an international border, either because there's no space within their own polity, because they live in a small island, or they live in a place where all the kind of areas which they would be able to have a livelihood in are also at risk, or for other reasons, related to the changes taking place in their country. And yet, and this is the second fact, at the moment, and I think for the foreseeable future, no government offers a legal migration pathway just because someone is exposed to climate change and is a climate migrant. No one. So, and I think many of you will be familiar with this. So you certainly cannot get refugee status because your island was flooded. You can't get a work permit because you live in a place which has become unbearably hot. You can't get a visitor's permit because your field is now a desert, and so on. So at best, you might get some sort of temporary humanitarian status, TPS it's called in the US, temporary protection status, which is by definition temporary and can be revoked. And as we're seeing all too painfully at the moment, those statuses are very precarious. So we have these two starting points. On the one hand, the prospect of very large scale forced movement, including because of climate change. We'll talk about that nexus. And on the other hand, the fact that many people who will be forced to cross an international border will not have access, because of the reasons why they're moving, to a legal status. And so this, of course, presents, first of all, a huge human challenge. You know, how many people are going to be living as kind of undocumented populations or without a legal status? And we are unfortunately all too familiar with what that means in terms of human and emotional security. But it also presents a substantial policy dilemma, because governments have a long-standing prerogative to control their borders and to regulate the entry of non-citizens. And it's difficult to see how that's going to change and why that would change. And so we have two likely scenarios, mutually incompatible, if you like, in terms of a rights-based approach to protecting human life. So that's what we're talking about in a way, or that's what element of what we're going to talk about. So, and I do think this whole question about the relationship between human settlement and human mobility and climate-related events is one of the very, very big issues, certainly for you know, all of us, but particularly I think for you know, the generation of students and this generation and those that will follow them. So we're very lucky to have Professor Teicher with us today. I've had the pleasure of having a conversation with her before, so I know we're in for a treat. Let me just briefly introduce Professor Teicher. She's an assistant professor of urban planning at the GSD at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And she works basically or broadly on how adaptation to climate change is shaping urban transformations across scales, it says in the bio. So she's really looking at how urban planning and urban conurbations are adapting to and affected by the forced migration of people. And she's doing a lot of really interesting research, some of which I hope she'll talk to us about, looking at the way in which populations move into new spaces and the impact that has on those new spaces. And of course, she has a long and illustrious record of publication and has a PhD in urban and regional planning from MIT, a Master of Architecture from UBC, and a BA in sociology and anthropology from Swarthmore College. So super well prepared. So Hannah, thank you so much for being with us today. So we shared a few kind of one or two exchanges, and I'm just going to kick off with a couple of questions. We're a very small group today, so really we don't need to make this too formal, and people should feel free to jump in and ask questions, I think, at any time. But the first thing I wanted to start with, just kind of as one does, is to think of the longue durée, or the big picture, or the historical picture. And to ask you, Hannah, you know, the intersection between climate change and migration, as far as I know, has only been recognized really in the last quarter of a century, roughly, maybe a bit more. But certainly when I was a young student of migration law, there was no mention of climate change at all. Now I'm very, very old, but still, you know, it is relatively recent. So, and yet, of course, climate change, I'm sure we know, has been a driving force for migration for a long time. This is not a recent development. So if you were just to kind of try to make the case, what would you point to as examples of past patterns of migration which have at least some intersection with climate change? What do you think would be some examples of that? Maybe people can think of others, you know, not now, but, you know, thinking over the you know, period of the last maybe couple of centuries, famous kind of incidents where we think people probably have moved in part because of climate change. But over to you.
And thanks for the introduction, and thanks everyone for being here today. I think that's a very important question. We really need to think about this in historical context. I think in the climate space, there is an unfortunate tendency to focus on climate as something kind of new and exceptional that makes all the problems that we're facing qualitatively different, but for the most part, they're not. And of course, there's been a long history of environmental migration. I think the most iconic example that's often referred to in American history is the Dust Bowl, when we saw massive dust storms in the Midwest and people moving to California, which really did reshape the US demographically. But there are many migrations that have had environmental components. So there's even a recent environmental history of the Great Migration, of Black people moving from the South north. And so I think that's another important point, because really when you think about climate-related migration, that related part is really essential. Climate is always just one of many factors. I tend to focus my research on the North American context, so many of my examples will be from that, but I think we should also look to the indigenous history of North America, and the indigenous scholar Kyle White talks about how odd it is that we do talk about environmental migration as some kind of new phenomenon, and that it was an essential part of the way indigenous people inhabited this landscape for centuries, and has really played a role in adaptive capacity now being undermined. So as indigenous people, we're forced to relocate to very, confined places. For example, in the Pacific Northwest, confined to coastal areas that they never would have chosen to inhabit year round. Then that creates a precarity and becomes a cause of a current need for environmental relocation.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very interesting. So just to pick up on some of the things you just said, firstly, I think the critical point that climate is nearly always one among many factors. And so certainly for me as an immigration lawyer, it's really interesting to note how rarely people will describe their own migration as being climate related. People don't, because unless it's an earthquake or a hurricane or a kind of so-called rapid onset event, the cumulative desertification of your habitus is not something that you necessarily will have front of mind when you finally make the decision to move. It's something that kind of accumulates slowly over time. And so I think that's also a reason why it's so hard to kind of make the connection between the pressure to move and climate as reasons why people need to be protected, because it's kind of incremental and it's linked to other things. So I think that's an important point. I'm thinking also way back when I first started practicing as a practicing human rights lawyer in Europe, in the UK. Many of my clients were Bangladeshis in England, and we always thought of them as they're people who came from remote villages it's called Azad Kashmir anyway, kind of in parts of what is now Bangladesh, who came and ended up being kind of night shift factory workers in the Midlands in English factories. And it was only much later that I realized that actually the reason all these people left was because their land was flooded. There were these big projects of building dams to kind of irrigate other territories. And so these peasant populations, subsistent peasants populations lost their land, but it was never, it was 20 or 30 years later that I realized that. So it's an interesting point that we never really thought about that. And of course, what you don't care about, you don't count, as we all know, and what you don't look for, you don't see. So I think that's a really interesting point. So the next thing I wanted to do is to kind of fairly quickly move forward now to here we are now, and to ask you, Hannah, what are the main ways in which you see climate change intersecting with migration today? And if you could say a little bit about, I'm sure most of, not everybody in this room is familiar with these distinctions, but, in the climate change discussion, there are these two big dichotomy between mitigation and adaptation and the dichotomy between sudden onset and slow onset. So maybe incorporate that into your answers. You talk about the intersection.
I mean, I think the easiest way to see the intersection of climate and migration is with the rapid onset events. And unfortunately, we've seen way too many of these recently, even close to home in North Carolina. There were the huge floods. We just saw the fires in LA. In both of those cases, a number of people end up being displaced. But there are also really visible effects of slower onset climate impacts now with, flooding. Norfolk, Virginia is a place that I've done a lot of research, and there are areas of Norfolk that are already subject to serious nuisance flooding. So, it gets to a point that it's, difficult to park your car on your block, or your house just keeps getting flooded again and again. And so people do start to slowly move. Clearly, real estate is already starting to be devalued in some coastal areas. And so, climate migration, it happens across so many different scales where it can be something that's just very close to home that causes just people to move nearby. It can cause moves within a region or long distance moves within a country or international migration. So there are all of these spectra of climate migration. And really, any possible climate risk that you can think of can be linked to migration. At the same time, it's really important to think about the role of adaptation in this. So even as places seemingly become uninhabitable, that doesn't mean that necessarily people move. So, and the flip side of migration or mobility is also immobility. And often people are choosing to stay in place, and sometimes they're forced to stay in place. But I think we need to think of that as part of the spectrum of migration as well. And it brings to the forefront the need to really focus on adaptation. So Jackie was talking about places becoming seemingly uninhabitable or being outside of the historical human climate niche, but that doesn't mean that people won't live there, actually. I mean, we have a long, long human history of people adapting to extreme climate conditions. So it may not be an ideal climate niche, but there still may be many ways that we may end up adapting to those places.
Yeah. So maybe I can ask you a follow-up question, which is in the migration kind of discussion generally, we often say that in the international sphere, it's not the poorest who migrate. It's a kind of inverted U curve, so the very poorest and the very richest tend to stay put. The very poorest because they don't have the means, the very richest because they have the ability to protect themselves from the hazards or the challenges of the location. But by contrast, internal migration, and particularly internal seasonal migration, often is the poorest. It's the poorest who have to cyclically move to work and then come back. It's very clear in India, for example. I mean, I think it affects 30, 50 million people, 60 million people who will move, for 7 months in the year and then come home to their land during the monsoon to, plant seeds and do whatever they need to do at home. How should we think about that in this context when you say some move and some don't? Do you think it is, would you be able to kind of map that onto some sort of income or wealth curve or age curve, or how should we think about that? Or is that not helpful?
No, I mean, I think what you said is broadly correct, though it may be at times that the wealthiest do also choose to move. I think generally people in that middle space will move. There's a whole interesting conversation about not just migration, but whether migration ends up serving as adaptation, because there are many times that people may migrate and then they end up in situations that are just as precarious as they had been. But now there's some emerging discussion about how even cyclical labor migration might serve as a form of adaptation, because people are able to send remittances home, or else they make money in the place that they go to work, and then they bring that money back home, and that allows them to adapt in place. And I think, that's possible. I'm fairly skeptical of that approach, and I've been doing some research on temporary foreign workers coming to Canada from Mexico and Guatemala and Jamaica. So these are temporary foreign workers in the agricultural sector, and they're in very precarious positions. And interestingly, while we had expected that climate change played a major role in them coming to Canada, what we found is that actually climate conditions are making their work in Canada very precarious. They're making the conditions difficult because of fires and smoke and flooding, and they're also creating less demand for their labor. And so in that case, they're not even making the money that they had counted on, and it doesn't serve as much as
coincidence, or is it because they are labor migrants that they get kind of like the worst type of jobs, and so they get the most precarious jobs?
I mean, I think it's some of both. I think largely it speaks to the fact that, well, we'd like to imagine globally and domestically that there are these receiving areas that are potentially more protected from climate change that actually very few places are. So, broadly, Canada is seen as this kind of safe place, and yet it's not. And there's so many climate impacts in Canada. But it is true that the agricultural workers are more exposed, just as all outdoor workers are. I mean, people in construction are also very exposed.
One other question I wanted to ask in that context, is there a sense in which sometimes adaptation is counterproductive? And I'm thinking in particular of some of the work of our colleague here, Sheila Jasanoff, who has written about how sometimes these adaptive technologies like solar parks are transported to settings where they actually, I think I'm right in saying she would argue that they destroy or they undermine local adaptive conditions that have been going for a long time and actually end up being counterproductive. Do you see any of that, where it's a kind of nearly like a colonization that, the way in which some areas, like in the global north, we think about this is a strategy for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This is a strategy for adapting. And we take this technology to a setting where maybe actually people have had for a long time other mechanisms for addressing these problems, and we actually undermine the structures they have. Is this something that you've seen or you've thought about?
I've definitely thought about it. And I think with any form of adaptation, there's always a huge risk of maladaptation. And it's really a difficult space to navigate. Maladaptation operates in a lot of ways, even with the best intentions for adaptation. Often it can just shift vulnerability in time or in space. I think what you're talking about is a little bit different than the way I've thought about maladaptation. I would see PV installations as more of a mitigation strategy than an adaptation strategy, but certainly there can be inappropriate technologies kind of foisted on communities that may have had better solutions of their own. But I'm not sure that that's an argument against adaptation itself.
I guess it's at a minimum an argument in favor of participation and consultation, so that you don't impose technologies on kind of populations whose views are not represented when their interests are the dominant ones, right? I mean, certainly in the Indian context, I've seen it myself in some of the work that we've done. You see these remote villages all of a sudden with these enormous solar parks, and you wonder, well, who asked for this to come here? Whose interests are they in? Who's benefiting? Who's losing out? Whose land was this in the first place? So I don't know enough about it, but it just seemed to me that there are different equities involved here, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's correct. I think that really points to the need for community-based adaptation, which is something I was just reading about today, preparing for my adaptation class, and something that I definitely emphasize. And I think in community-based adaptation, there's really a need to look at those kinds of power differentials and, like you're saying, who wins and who loses and who's setting the agenda. And it's very difficult to lead productive community processes that really do bring all the voices to the table and end up, equitably serving the community. But usually that would be the goal, or, that's the kind of ideal type of adaptation.
So Hannah, how would that work if you're talking about community adaptation and you're talking about a situation in which there may, like the one you're talking about in Canada, where there are international migrants who are now part of the community, maybe more recent arrivals and certainly less powerful stakeholders, but nevertheless with huge interests at stake there. How does one, what's a good model of community adaptation in that context? And can you give us any examples that you think have worked well?
Yeah, I mean, that's an incredibly difficult context in which to be trying to develop community-based adaptation, because in that case, the temporary foreign workers have a very precarious status. Unfortunately, so far in Canada, they have had employer-tied work permits, and so they're really stuck. That's something that may be changing soon, but I'm not sure at this point that it would really be possible to engage those workers in a meaningful community process, because they would be afraid to speak up, for their own interests. But I can point to some more successful community strategies. There's an organization that I work with, Climigration Network, which is US-based and has a number of community partners. So the network is all about supporting community-led relocation, which is similar to community-led adaptation. And it's really all about building strong relationships over time with communities and figuring out what the communities want, and then helping to support them in the process that they're pursuing. So providing technical capacity and support, creating coalitions of people that are working towards similar ends. And I think, that's starting to show some results.
Let's say a bit more about that. How does that actually work? Because of course there isn't empty space waiting for people to come and, normally and live in. So how, if you have a community collectively deciding to move, are they then working with kind of builders and people who are building a new environment, or are they occupying an abandoned environment, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's very difficult. So I think it can take a number of forms, and it's true that there's usually not just land sitting around. And so there are a number of communities that Climigration is working with that are in the process of trying to identify places that they might move to. And it's, they haven't really accomplished it yet, but they're working on it and trying to figure out the pathways. In another class that I'm teaching right now, we're actually looking at the intersection of climate migration and land back. And so we've been looking at case studies of land back around the US, building on others' work in this space. So there's a great map I'd suggest you take a look at, Land Back North America, that was compiled by Ward Lyles and Sarah Deer. So we've been using that as a foundation for our work. And there are a number of cases there where Indigenous communities have been able to acquire land through various mechanisms. And in very few cases, that has directly been for climate-related migration. So there's a case, again, on the Olympic Peninsula in the Pacific Northwest, where the Quileute tribe was able to get land in the Olympic National Park. This was under the Obama administration. Unfortunately, they were not given any funding to then build new buildings on the land, but at least there was the potential to move to higher ground. And so that's one of the few examples where that has actually started to happen.
And when we were having the back and forth by email, you said something about corporate efforts. So maybe you could describe that.
Yes.
So we just get a sense and maybe link it to migration. Are we just talking about internal migration in that context, or could this also be a way of bringing in, I don't know, Vietnamese nurses, or, some sort of bigger picture labor migration, which might also then address climate-related risks that people face?
Yeah, when I'm thinking about corporate climate migration, I'm thinking about it more in terms of corporations actually moving as a result of climate risks. And this is something that is just beginning to emerge, and there's not a lot of research in this area yet. So far, it's really happening anecdotally. So there have been companies that have moved after major hurricanes, like HP ended up leaving Houston after Hurricane Harvey, and they ended up moving some of their headquarters to Austin, and then they moved to the Great Lakes region. And there have been a few companies like that that are just starting to move. And there are also some emerging investment advisory firms that are talking about resilient places, and they're trying to direct real estate investment and corporate investment to what they perceive as more resilient places.
So just to interrupt you, there is a
Yeah.
resilient place, a place which is not on a coast and not near forests. And I mean, there would be a lot of negatives that you'd want to exclude. Well, how would you, I mean, is Boston a resilient place? We have a lot of shoreline. No. So what is a resilient place?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky one. And it goes back to this very fraught concept of the climate haven, which I was kind of alluding to earlier, where there are these imagined receiving zones that a lot of people imagine to be safer, but in many ways they're not. But there are places that have relatively less climate risk, have relatively fewer natural disasters. So far, that has tended to be conceived of as the Midwest. There's also the Great Lakes, so abundant source of fresh water, more temperate climate. So there's some of those things. But I think in conceptualizing receiving zones, it's really important to note that those kinds of physical characteristics are only a starting point. That does not in itself make it a good receiving place. It also needs a good socioeconomic characteristics. And I have a project looking at this right now, thinking about housing affordability and availability in those places, but also adaptation capacity and integration capacity. So again, like having the water availability and the temperate climate is just a starting point, and it really remains to be seen how that will play out. But there are some of those places that are trying to sell themselves as receiving cities. And there's even the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, which did a joint study with MIT looking at corporate relocation to Michigan and trying to make the business case that businesses should move to Michigan because it's a more resilient place.
It's really fascinating. I just have a couple more questions and then we'll open it up. So one question is, as we think about people making choices about moving, how important is it, do you think, to kind of be able to attribute kind of causal ingredients? In the immigration law context, the purpose of your migration is always a central concern. Are you just coming to get married? Are you just coming to claim welfare? Are you just coming to X, Y, and Z? And of course, the philosophical, but actually also the true answer to that is that most human conduct is multifactorial. You're coming because all of the above, maybe, but from the point of view of planning and the point of view of thinking about urban structures, how important is it for you to have a sense of, the quantum of climate change that is going to be propelling people? I mean, I don't know if you even think about it that way, but to me, it's a big issue, because I think that climate is one ingredient among many. One shouldn't overstate it, and one should also not neglect it. But I think we do both things. So yeah, I just wondered how you think about that. And is it important to prove how important one factor is? Is it important from the point of view of access to public resources? Is it important from the point of view of, I don't know, jumping a queue that there might be or something? I don't know how you think about this.
Yeah, it seems to be a persistent question. Is there any reason that climate-related migration is any different from any other type of migration? And I think there are ways that it is and that it isn't. And as cities are trying to plan for climate migration, there are a few potentially unique considerations. So in some cases, when people end up being displaced by a large natural disaster, then there can be a large influx of people due to one disaster to one nearby place in many cases. So this happened in California with the Paradise Fire, and a lot of people ended up relocating to Chico, which was really not prepared to take them in. So in that case, you can see the kind of climate-related impacts. But I think in terms of long-term planning for receiving communities to take in newcomers of many sorts, whether it's a result of climate or not, the really important climate point is that that place that is taking people in also needs to be adapting to climate change, because no place is somehow safe from climate change. So we need to think about how both of those operate together, and if at all possible, find synergistic ways of planning for people coming in and adapting. So thinking about how physical adaptation through infrastructure, whether that's water or power infrastructure, can accommodate newcomers, but also thinking about social resilience. So building ties between newcomers and longtime residents so that there are those kinds of social bonds in a community that become really important in a disaster situation. So there are many ways that the long-term planning is affected by climate factors, and then migration is just one piece of that.
You said that no place is immune from climate change, but does that mean that there's some places which are going to benefit, which are going to become more habitable? And should we be thinking about, I don't know, Alaska or Greenland? Of course, some people are thinking about it, dare I say, or whatever. I mean, but is there a kind of a silver lining is too glib, but is there some sort of sense in which one can really see a progressive move from hotter to cooler or drier to wetter? Or I don't know how we should think about that, because we've seen in the migration context, historically people move from rural to urban. People have moved a lot from, south to north. People have moved in some ways from east to west, but not in the simple way. So these patterns are complex. And I'm wondering whether, from the climate perspective, there is also some sort of, again, talking about the longue durée of history, some sort of pattern that we can see, but even anticipate and think about.
Yeah, it seems likely that over the long term that there will be some kind of urban restructuring as a result of climate change. So, I mean, think about historically the migration to the Sun Belt. There's some indications that that's starting to slow down, maybe possibly reversing. And so people may start to move more northward. They may start to move inland. The coasts may no longer be the center of cultural and political gravity. So I think we can imagine that there would be some serious long-term shifts, but there may also be more deconcentration. So that's another thing. It may be less that people are reconcentrating in different large cities, and they may be spreading out more. So, I mean, I think a lot of this is really to be determined, but it is worth looking out for the emerging signals and thinking about how this will play out over the long term.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Last question from me. You work primarily on America, Hannah, but you know a lot about this field more generally. Do you think that given the very different political discourse around climate change in different places, there are likely to be substantial differences between continents and between different policies? I'm particularly thinking, US versus Europe, actually, where I mean, I might be wrong, but I think that, the kind of climate skepticism, to put it politely, that we have here is much less in evidence in Europe. So does that mean that Europe will be ahead in some ways, and that America will find itself burdened by this skepticism or ignorance or cynicism or whatever of some of the political leaders in a way that will really have repercussions, big visible repercussions?
Yeah, well, there seems to be an increasing divergence, I'd say, between the US and Europe these days. But there's the climate politics, and then there's the immigration politics, and then the two come together in climate migration. And so I'd say clearly the US is way behind in thinking about climate, and to the extent that we increasingly can't talk about or plan for climate, that will put us in a really difficult position. But we've, of course, seen huge anti-immigrant sentiment across Europe. And so I think it remains to be seen whether that will abate at all, and possibly even in reaction to the US, maybe Europe will become more open to immigration. That's really hard to say, but it's, yeah, I think that's a really difficult one. I think I'm not answering this well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a perfectly reasonable answer, that yes, there is divergence, and yes, it's very hard to predict. But I'm really wondering if adaptation is really essential, and in some areas, say in this country, there's a much less progress. That is this going to really affect the landscape of who has even options for where to go, and what's the kind of knock-on effect of that going to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, in the US, it's very, very troubling to not be able to plan for climate change at the federal level. And yet, as an urban planner, I have to say, at least we can still look to cities, and cities are very aware of climate and are planning for adaptation. And so there is some hope still at the local and state level to be able to plan. And then beyond that, cities network with each other, both within the country and beyond. There are all of these transnational city networks that work together on climate planning. And so there are ways that, even though countries may have very different politics, that cities across those countries are still able to meaningfully cross-pollinate and learn from each other, and maybe not be left so far behind.
So maybe we can think about, just to kind of use some of the current terminology, we can think about sanctuary in a much broader sense, of not just a sanctuary for people who are, without a legal status or have been made and documented in various ways, but actually sanctuary more broadly also as cities that are working together across borders to promote some sort of climate rights, maybe even.
Yeah, I think that's a hopeful lens, and there have been a few organizations now working in that space. So C40, which is a major climate network, has been working with the Mayor's Migration Council, and they're really elevating best practices and stories of this working. And it's been really important, I think, as there's so much pushback on immigration, that there's still a number of cities that are very explicitly trying hard to be welcoming.
And as somebody who works in this area, talking to a group of young policymakers, potential researchers, are there bits of research that you would really like to be able to draw on to make the case for some of the urban adaptation or urban changes? And I ask this question because one of my colleagues who's working closely with the FXB Center where I'm based is looking at the ways in which public health researchers can increase public health research on specifically children to show the impact of climate change, and how that can be used in litigation. So, the litigation being brought by children, by young people, about the impact of climate change on their lives. And there are particular aspects of, public health scholarship which could be very useful. So I'm wondering if there are other types of, policy or other types of research that would be very helpful. We, the Carr-Ryan Center, think about human rights and rights-based entitlements. So are there kind of, would you have a wish list of things that people might work on that would strengthen the kind of ability of urban planners and people working like this to make the case?
Yes, there's so much research that needs to be done. But one special interest of mine is that intersection of integration and adaptation in receiving places. And I think we would really benefit from a lot of case studies and comparative case studies across national contexts so that we can understand the way different political environments are conditioning the way that happens, but looking at it across a multi-level context, so understanding everything from how national policy affects it down to how this is really unfolding at a community level on the ground. So looking for those incipient promising practices where immigrants are being integrated in a way that also addresses climate concerns. So for example, I looked to a case study of Worcester that I did recently, and there was one of the most promising areas was in their food security work. So there was a regional food network, and they had mobile food markets, and those markets sell food produced by new American farmers, and then they sell it to immigrant neighborhoods. So they're providing culturally appropriate food, and they're regularly responsive to what the people want from the market. And then in those farms, they're also looking at how seeds from the Caribbean might grow in Massachusetts. And so that addresses, how growing zones are going to be changing. And so there's just this really interesting emerging nexus that I don't think people have thought about a lot. And there's a lot of room to identify those kinds of just practices on the ground.
That's really interesting. It's the opposite of the kind of old technique of people stealing the intellectual property of indigenous people and transporting it. Here it's the people themselves who are bringing different types of cultivation, and then it's flourishing in a new context. So thank you. That's really interesting. Okay, so we have a few minutes left. So yeah, do we need the mic? Yeah, please just say your name and then make your question. Yeah, hi,
Judith, I'm a fellow of the Carr Center and the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. Thank you so much for your compelling interventions and remarks. They're very, very, very thought-provoking. I'm very interested in the accountability side of your work in terms of the role that corporations play, and especially focusing on the CSR component of corporations, so corporate social responsibility, and then intersecting that component with migration policy, public health issues, which are fundamental, and of course, climate justice. So I'm just wondering what kind of allocation or efforts or time has been attributed to public advocacy, and for lack of a better word, lobbying, or rather public advocacy towards corporations to heighten their CSR policies and become more accountable for all of these discrepancies and inequities within the US, for instance, and the broader international community.
I mean, I think we're in a moment where, unfortunately, ESG has fallen into disfavor, and so that's not going to be happening very much. And for the most part, I see this corporate climate migration as somewhat of a threat to cities and communities, because I think there's a huge risk of corporations moving into places and taking water and taking land and really constraining the opportunities for communities. But it's true that they should be held accountable. And so, but the first thing is exposing the extent to which this is actually happening. So I think we just need to understand the phenomenon first, and then we could call for accountability.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm Surbi. I'm an MPID student at HKS in international development. And I've been particularly interested in the problem of extreme heat exposure in India. And it's a problem that feels especially tricky to me because South Asia, as you know, like there is some like labor mobility there, but like Pakistan, India isn't a particularly porous border. And then within India as well, it's just like overall such a dense country that I really struggle, and different regions have different issues with like, flooding, heat, and so on. So I struggle to understand the climate migration question for India. Is it just that, and to the extent that you might be familiar, like do you think it's just going to become like an increasingly unlivable space, or would you see more like illegal forms of migration emerging, or like more regional migration into other parts of Asia itself?
I'm not really familiar enough with the Indian context to be able to comment very well, but I think I would just go back to my comment earlier about being cautious about proclaiming places uninhabitable. And I mean, I know that the heat does become an extreme problem, but maybe this does become more of an adaptation question and figuring out how people can stay.
Just jump in there. I think that's a really interesting issue. I mean, in terms of the extreme heat, you know, I mean, Paul Farmer, our wonderful colleague who you know, tragically died last year, always used to say that out of respect for his patients, he would insist that clinics where people lined up to wait have trees. So making a scorching place in Rwanda or in Haiti or wherever bearable for people just waiting, and sometimes people who are sick or people with sick relatives waiting in the shade. Now that just seems such a simple strategy, but you convert an unbearable situation into a bearable one. And it's often struck me in the Indian context, and this may be very simplistic, but you know, wealth has so much to do with whether heat is unbearable or not, because if you have access to air conditioning or you have access to refrigeration, it's a very different proposition from if you don't. And I think one of the tensions, and having discussed this with also with colleagues who know much more about it than I do in India, there is a kind of a tension between increasing the access to fridges or AC, which at the moment are all carbon consumers, but from the perspective of justice, of reducing extreme heat and the consequences of extreme heat for impoverished populations, it's a priority. There's a tension between that and arguing, on the other hand, that you need places like India to reduce their carbon emissions and reduce the amount that they depend on this. And so I you know, for a long time, my priority has always been, well, deal with the human cost first, and you know, the brown versus the green. But it's not a very sensible, durable strategy. But I think that, and so now people are talking about paint, and I mean, you're probably familiar with this, other ways of reducing the heat, at least indoors. But it is a humongous issue, having worked in many schools in rural India. I mean, the level of heat that kids are exposed to on a daily basis and are meant to concentrate in is unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge problem, and it's one of the, you know, forms of maladaptation that I was referring to earlier, is when you're trying to adapt by cooling that causes more emissions. And so guess what I would go back to is my architecture background and looking at more passive strategies, which do have limits, but there are also many, you know, long established building technologies in hotter places that can work. And, you know, often those were kind of shut down by more, you know, modern strategies for cooling. And so in many cases, we need to go back to that. And then there are also more building technologies that are not exactly passive, but ways that cooling strategies can be kind of built into building envelopes so that it's not just about using air conditioning. And urban greening is a huge factor. So, I mean, we need lots of green to help cool cities.
But actually, I do sort of believe this. I probably am a devil, but you know, it takes a long time to build enough green to make a city cooler. Whereas if you increase the supply of air conditioning, that's quick. And if it really is, you know, creating asthma and creating really life-threatening illnesses, how do we justify waiting when many of us actually rely on those strategies anyway? It does trouble me. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be pursuing the more adaptive strategies, but human time span and planetary time span are very different, and we, as kind of reductive human rights activists, tend to think of that human time span as the priority. So it's something that really does concern me, but I don't know how I should think about that better.
Well, maybe it's a both and strategy. So you have to have the air conditioning immediately to help with the cooling, but at the same time, you can improve the building and improve the urban environment so that over time, there's at least less demand for the air conditioning, because it's not just an on or off. It's also a question of how much you use.
Thank you again for this talk. I kind of have a question for you, Dr. Bhabha. You started the conversation discussing what is really to come with mass migration and how there's no such thing as a climate refugee. What do you see us doing? Do you see a restructuring of international law and refugee law? How do you see us dealing with that? What is a rights-based approach to that?
Actually, that was one of the questions I was going to ask Professor Teicher, and I didn't, so I'm paying the price for that. But no, it's a very important question that we discuss a lot in the migration context. I think it's fair to say that there's the following consensus. One, that there are certain very limited types of climate change impact which might qualify as refugee protection. If, for example, you could show that, let's say, indigenous people and only indigenous people are repeatedly exposed to flooding because that's the only place they're allowed to stay, and you can make a discrimination-based argument. You could argue that's a form of persecution because only indigenous people live in that area. Only, untouchables are forced to live near a kind of polluted site. Roma communities have actually made that argument in Serbia about having been forced to live in and close to polluted, chemically polluted area. But that is certainly a possibility, and that has some legs, but it's a tiny proportion of the picture. From the bigger picture point of view, I think the vast majority of us in the migration and refugee protection field feel that it would be foolish and foolhardy and actually irresponsible to open up the Refugee Convention for renegotiation, because the chances of losing the baby with the bathwater would be huge. In other words, given how political discussion is at the moment with respect to refugee protection and asylum, the last thing we want to do is open up a discussion about these conventions, which we just are clinging on to kind of, by the skin of our teeth, so to speak. So I think that's one part of the answer. There has been a lot of work in the broader migration context thinking about ways to address climate-related or climate-induced migration, and to think of ways in which countries can think about shared responsibility. And the global compacts that were introduced, basically as a result of 2015 and the large-scale migration into Europe, in the sense that, the powers that be were not at all prepared for this. These global compacts that were a result refer to these mechanisms and talk about the imperative of responsibility sharing and thinking, including about climate migrants. So there are mechanisms, and there are mechanisms for rewarding and punishing countries depending on how much they do and they don't contribute. And I think it's a fascinating ongoing area of work with a lot of good input being attached. At the end of the day, I think it's going to be the political will of people who are at the table, and of communities and of voters and of affected populations, that is going to push for real change. So just like there have been some progressive changes in the migration context, for example, after Russia invaded Ukraine, admittedly a white Christian population, but nevertheless, there was no love lost between Ukrainians and Poles, given World War II history. And yet there was an amazing reaction because there was a sense that in the face of this kind of attack, you had to do something. And there was a general activation of political will. So I think similarly, no change happens automatically, but all sorts of changes can be created and can be motivated. And, we've seen this, even you guys have seen this in your lifetime, political positions, for example. I mean, now we are seeing backsliding, but political positions around sexuality radically changed in one generation, much faster than many people thought they could. So I think there are strategies for thinking about how countries share responsibility. There's strategies for thinking about how countries that don't have the ability to receive people may nevertheless have the ability to contribute in some other way. And I think all that is important work. And I think, the point we were making earlier about how important research is to help these arguments move forward. So we're not in the realm of invention or imagination or these hugely discrepant numbers, but we're talking really about science and trying to recenter the argument in those ways. So I think it's an uphill battle, but I'm not completely pessimistic at all, because this is ultimately going to affect everybody. And powerful people have children and grandchildren who are bringing this to their attention and making them feel that this is urgent. And that's exactly what has to happen. And then we'll end.
Thank you. Yes, I was wondering, Dr. Hannah, if you have any specific examples of how you've seen cities adapt to the change of to the actual moments of climate change, and also the intersection between migration. Specifically, you were talking about any specific cities or in the level states that you can give us.
Yeah. I mean, this is a very new area, so I think there aren't a lot of concrete examples of cities specifically doing work at that intersection. I mean, there's a huge amount of adaptation that's happened, and it is the things like green infrastructure, everything from bioswales to absorb stormwater and extreme precipitation, to trees to cool cities down, and all kinds of seawalls, both gray and green. But there is one city that I think has been ahead of the curve, is a small one, Ann Arbor in Michigan. And Missy Stoltz works there, and she's someone who's been thinking about this issue for a long time. And so I know I've read about that. She sees anecdotally that they are in their second or third wave of climate migration already. And I know as a sustainability planner there that she's been taking that into consideration in all kinds of long-term city planning. So that would be one place to look at.
Okay. Hi, I'm Luke Atkins Barnett. I'm from Highland Park, Dallas, Texas. Anyway, just while we're wrapping up, I was going to say another thing that I've seen on a municipal level with states like Texas and Arizona, being from the South, and this extreme heat, that we've discussed being such a huge factor. And with these rapidly growing high schools and middle schools and elementary schools, is shading has been, a big thing that's been factored in city governments, and something that can be constructed, in a relatively quick manner and pretty cheap. And so, there are kids that are dying of heat strokes, on the playground, in fourth grade. And a lot of these large playgrounds in these rapidly developed, metropolitan areas, all the trees were cut down. And so building, these artificial shading structures have been very helpful. So just one more food for thought thing. Thank you.
constructive note. Thank you for that example. So thank you all for participating. And Hannah, thank you for, wonderfully insightful comments. It was really a pleasure having our conversation.
Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.